Hi everyone! It's episode 11 and we are getting closer to our goal. Today we will be using XNormal and GIMP to manually prepare and combine our texture maps into the images that Skyrim needs. At the end of our last video, we got our carefully crafted texture files out of Mixer. But unfortunately, we can't just plug these into a NIF and head into Skyrim. Why not? Well, it mostly comes down to one little acronym. PBR. We saw this acronym while working in Mixer, but we didn't talk about what it means. PBR stands for Physically Based Rendering, and it is basically the concept of creating photorealistic effects by simulating how light and materials behave in the real world. It does this by using a combination of different texture images on your 3D model. Here are a couple of good articles by A23D that explains it a bit more, and I'll put the links to these in the description. Because nothing can be easy or straightforward, there are two different types of PBR workflows, metallic and specular. These are simply two ways to achieve the same goal. From a practical perspective, it means that some of the texture maps are different between the two workflows. Our process in this series is based on the metallic workflow. You can read more about the differences in these two articles, which are linked in the description. You can use either workflow for making Skyrim assets, and there are pros and cons to both. Generally, it is recommended that beginners use the metallic workflow, but there's nothing stopping you from using the specular workflow if you find that you prefer it. So, how does all this relate to Skyrim? Well, Skyrim does not use either PBR workflow, and in fact, Skyrim, by default, does not use PBR shading at all. So we can't simply use the image files that we exported from Mixer as they are. Instead, we have to combine and convert them into the kinds of texture files that Skyrim needs. Before we talk about how to do that, let's have a quick look at what our exported PBR images are. We made these using the PBR metalness workflow, and so we have these 5 images to work with. Albedo is the base color with no shadows, highlights, reflections, or glow added into it. Ambient occlusion, or AO, is a grayscale image representing where shadows will be on the object. Metalness is typically a black and white image where black means no metal and white means metal. You will rarely have anything in between. Normal is the purplish-colored map that adds the appearance of depth or grain. Roughness is a grayscale image that controls the smoothness/glossiness, where white is rough and dull, and black is smooth and glossy. You can read more about this and other maps in this article, which is linked in the description. If you have looked at Skyrim NIFs or worked with Skyrim textures at all, you'll know that many, probably most, assets have only 2 texture files. Some have a few more, but usually all you have is a diffuse image and a normal map. The diffuse image has to be created by combining the base color data, which is our albedo image, with baked-in lighting information, which is our ambient occlusion or AO map, plus at a minimum the curvature map, although cavity maps can also be included for extra punch. The normal map in Skyrim is not a standard normal map. It includes a specular map in its alpha channel. If that makes no sense to you, it's okay. We will walk through that in a bit. Importantly, you cannot use a regular normal map in Skyrim, or else you'll end up with a very plasticky or slimy looking object. This happens because the model will be missing specular data. If you look at a regular normal map versus a Skyrim normal map, you can see how different they are. Let's take our images and walk through how to combine them for Skyrim. I will be using GIMP for this because it's free and because it's the program I know best. You can use other programs, and I'll point you to the AU Wiki here for some software recommendations. Before we get going with this, I'll note that if you use Substance Painter to texture your model, there is a great add-on that you can get here that will create the Skyrim texture maps for you. I don't use Substance Painter yet, so I can't comment any more than that. I'll also note that I did not make up the methods that I'm going to show you today. These are from the Beyond Skyrim and Arcane University experts, with my own interpretation thrown on top. There are many ways to go about doing this, and it doesn't really matter how you get there, as long as your textures look good in the game. Alright, we have to start this process by doing some pre-work. We have these 5 maps, but they are not the only ones we need. We also need a gloss map, a specular map, and optionally a cavity map, but not the one that we baked earlier. Let's do the cavity map first. This is a grayscale image that emphasizes the cavities in your textured mesh. It is optional, but it can really add some nice punch to make the model pop, as shown in this great article by Paul Paulino. And we're going to need it for the method that I'm following to create our specular map. Before we make the cavity map, let's agree that cavity maps and curvature maps are not quite the same thing. The differences, according to Google's AI, are that a cavity map stores ambient occlusion, which is essentially shadows, mainly in the small crevices, and it's important for realistic shading. A curvature map stores the convexity and concavity of a mesh and is especially useful for defining areas where a surface may have wear, highlights, dirt, and so on. Here is how a cavity and curvature map compare for our donuts. We used the curvature map, which we baked from our high poly and low poly models, to make some cool effects in Mixer. And the curvature map can be used in place of the cavity map when combining the textures. But I actually think the cavity map gives us more detail, and that's just too delicious to pass up. I baked a preliminary cavity map earlier in XNormal from the low poly and high poly meshes, but that one is no longer applicable because I added more stuff during the texturing process. So we need to make an updated one, and fortunately this is easy to do in XNormal. We just plug in our normal map and push some buttons. Open up XNormal. Go to Tools and select Tangent Space Normal Map to Cavity Map. Then drag and drop your normal map into the first box. Change the swizzle to -Y since that's how we exported it from Mixer. Right-click in the cavity map box and select Generate. Play with the settings until you like how it looks. I have found that EDT with contrast somewhere between 1 and 3 generally seems good. Right-click again, choose Save Cavity Map, and navigate to the desired location. Type in a name, choose the file type, and you'll want either PNG or TGA, and then hit Save. The confirmation window will pop up, so hit Yes, and then wait a few minutes for the map to be created and saved. Now repeat the process for the plate. Drag and drop in the normal map, make sure swizzle is -Y, right-click in the cavity map box and select Generate. Then tweak the settings if needed, and right-click again and choose Save Cavity Map. Give it a new name, set the type to PNG or TGA, hit Save, and then Yes, and wait a few minutes. You can see here the nice detail for our donuts that has been baked into this cavity map. Now we need to do one more thing for these new maps, but we're done with XNormal, so go ahead and close that up, and then open GIMP or your other 2D software of choice. The cavity maps need to have their alpha channel removed. Drag and drop your baked donut cavity map into the window, and you can see the transparency shown here by the checkered gray background. Go to Layer, Transparency, and select Remove Alpha Channel. And now you should be able to see that it looks opaque. For Skyrim, we generally want this map to be fairly bold and emphasize the cavities more. So go to Colors, Levels, and at the top box for Input Levels, move the black slider to not quite halfway. You should be able to see the cavities getting darker as you do this. Click OK. The last thing is to clamp the white level, which creates a cleaner map. Go to Colors, Levels, and tick the box next to Clamp Output. Then move the white slider for output levels slightly down from the max. Somewhere around 220 or 230 is probably good, and then click OK. That one is done, so go to File, export as, choose the location and file name, and make sure it's set for PNG or TGA, then hit export. You'll probably get a warning if you use the same file name as the original that we just baked in XNormal, and you can either replace it, which is what I'm doing, or you can make a new one by changing the name. In the next pop-up, I pretty much just go with the defaults, so click Export again and wait for a few minutes until GIMP finishes. Now we repeat for the plate. Close the donut map by clicking the little X up here next to the thumbnail, and we can just discard changes since we exported the file that we want to keep. Then drag and drop in the plate cavity map that we just baked. Go to Layer, Transparency, and select Remove Alpha Channel. Then go to Colors, Levels, and move the black slider for input levels to not quite halfway and click OK. Think that looks pretty good. Go to Colors, Levels again, and tick the box for clamp output. Then move the white slider for output levels down a bit to around 230 or until you like how it looks. I actually nudged mine down to about 217. When you're happy with the result, go to File, and this time, to save some clicks, I'm just going to choose the option to overwrite the original. When GIMP finishes, I'll have a quick look to make sure this looks good. And yep, I think there's nice contrast here, and it doesn't look too bright for the whites. So close the plate cavity map in GIMP by clicking the little X on the thumbnail, and then you can just select Discard Changes in the pop-up. All right, now we need to make something called a local gloss map. A gloss map is basically just an invert of the roughness map. Local gloss just means that we are going to edit it further for Skyrim by clamping the white level so that it doesn't get too bright. Drag and drop your donut roughness map into GIMP. Go to Colors and choose Linear Invert. If you find later that this is too bright, you can undo and use regular invert instead. But try the next step before you decide to do that because we're going to cap the brightness at a lower level than what you see here. Go to Colors, Levels, and tick the box for Clamp Output. And then move the white slider in output levels down to about 70 or 80%, which is around 200-ish in the little value box here. And then click OK. The local gloss map will be mostly white, but it can't be too white or it can cause or contribute to blinding white textures in the game. Once you are happy with it, go to File, Export As, choose the location and file name, type should be PNG or TGA, and hit Export, and then export again at the pop-up. When that's done, close the donut local gloss map. You can discard changes, and now we repeat for the plate. Load in your plate roughness map by dragging and dropping it into the window. Go to Colors and select Linear Invert. For the plate, you can see that this is super bright and we are losing detail. So I'm going to undo that by going to Edit, Undo, or you can Control Z, and then go back to Colors and choose Regular Invert instead. This looks a lot better, and since the brightness is already fairly muted, I'm actually going to skip clamping the whites and just export it as it is. So File, Export As, the location and name, make sure it's PNG or TGA, and then hit Export, and export again at the next pop-up. Once that is finished, close this file and we can discard changes again. For the last of our pre-work, we need to make a specular map. There are multiple ways to do this, and just saying specular map can cause an allergic reaction because of differing opinions on which way is best. The easiest way to get a specular map is to use your roughness map and invert it. This works, and it's not terrible, so please feel free to do this if you're happy with the results. But I feel compelled to tell you that a roughness map or a gloss map or any of the other maps we have here are actually not specular maps. You can see an example of the differences here. Being a perfectionist, I prefer to make an actual specular map using a longer process. So that's what I'm going to show you here. But with that said, you do you, and I promise not to judge. Remember that the only goal here is to get really great looking textures out the other side. Okay, so this process is going to get a little wild because it involves combining a lot of layers. Let's start off by loading in a copy of the donut albedo map. Since we have metallic parts, some of our sprinkles, we have to include our metalness map in the process. So drag that in and make sure it's on top of the albedo over here in the Layers pane. Set the metalness layer's blending mode to Overlay, and then go to Colors and select Linear Invert. The metallic sprinkles will turn black. Next, we need to remove the color from the albedo map. Select the albedo layer in the Layers pane, then go to Color, Components, and Extract Component. In the pop-up, choose HSV value and click OK. Then go to Color, Levels, tick the box for Clamp Input, and type 2.2 into the little box next to it. Hit OK, and don't freak out yet about how the image looks. Find your new cavity map for the donuts, then drag and drop that into the window. Make sure it goes to the top of the layer stack, or drag and drop it there if needed. I'm just going to go ahead and rename the layers here so that you'll have an easier time seeing what's what. For the cavity map, set the blending mode to multiply. Find the local gloss map for your donuts and drag and drop that over. Make sure it's at the top of the stack, and set its blending mode to multiply. Now I think this looks pretty good. It has nice detail, grayscale across most of the spectrum without having any white parts being overly bright. Now with all of the layers visible, right-click in the Layers area and select New from Visible. Make sure this new layer has captured all of the detail correctly, then turn off all the original layers and export the new visible layer as PNG or TGA. And wait for that to finish. Now close this file, and again you can discard changes, and we'll repeat the process to make a plate specular map. Load in the plate albedo map. There's no metal, so we can skip that step and move on to removing the color from this albedo map. Go to Color, Components, Extract Component, and choose HSV value. Hit OK. Then go to Color, Levels, tick Clamp Input, set the value to 2.2, and click OK. Load in the cavity map on top of that, and set its blending mode to multiply. Then load in the local gloss map on the very top, and set that to multiply. Now right-click, select New from Visible, turn the other layers off, and export the result as PNG or TGA by going to File, Export As, set the name and location, confirm the format, then export, export again, and wait until it finishes. Close that file, discarding the changes again since we already exported our final one. And that's our specular maps done. You want your specular map to be lighter for shiny parts so it will be more reflective, and darker for matte parts which will be less reflective. And it should show detail and have nice grayscale gradients. Hopefully, your specular maps now exemplify that. So we're now done with the pre-work, which is actually the longest part of this process. It's going to be fairly easy now to make the diffuse, the environment, and the normal maps from this point. I'll point you first to the AU Wiki for how to do this. I'm going to do something a little different, but you can certainly just follow the AU steps exactly as written here and get great looking textures. Okay, let's make the diffuse textures for these donuts. First, load in the albedo map by dragging and dropping it into GIMP. Since we have these metallic sprinkles, we need to include the metalness map. And I'll admit I'm kind of winging it here, so please don't blindly do this for all metal things. Drag and drop the donut metalness map on top of the albedo and set its blending mode to multiply. Then go to Colors and select Linear Invert. Now, I don't want my metallic sprinkles to be totally black, so I'm going to change the opacity of the metalness layer to be around 80% so that we retain some of the red and silver color. Now we add the specular map that we just made. Put that on top of the stack and set it to multiply. Go to Colors, Levels, tick the box for Clamp Input, enter a value of 0.45, and hit OK. Then go to Colors and Invert. Next up is the cavity map, so drag and drop that onto the top of the layer stack. Set the blending mode to Soft Light. You can also try Multiply or other modes, but I liked how this one looked with Soft Light. For the last layer, drag and drop in your ambient occlusion map and make sure it's at the very top of the stack. Set it to Soft Light 2, or again, you can try Multiply or other modes, whatever you like best. Now I think the way I made this diffuse texture looks pretty nice, but there isn't really a hard and fast rule for how to do this. You can play with the layer orders or try other blending modes, so feel free to experiment and find a combination that looks good to you. The important thing is that your final diffuse should include the appearance of depth and shadow and contrast, which the albedo does not have. And it should look real because Skyrim relies on having all of this detail on a single diffuse texture. Once you're happy with the final image, right-click in the Layers area and select New from Visible. Turn off all the other maps and then export the visible layer. File, Export As, set name and location, type should be PNG or TGA, hit Export, and then Export again. Now this will export as the original resolution, which for me was 4K, but we don't need 4K for these donuts in the game, and 1K is probably enough. So I'm also going to export a 1K version to take forward. To resize this image, I'll select the Scale tool, grab the bottom right corner in the viewport, and drag up a little until we get the pop-up window. In that pop-up, I'll set the width and height to 1024, and if you toggle the little link icon, it will resize them both proportionally. And then hit Scale. Next, go to Image, Canvas Size, toggle the little link on, and then set Width to 1024 and hit Enter, which should also then make the height 1024. In the Resize Layers drop-down, select all visible layers and then hit Resize. The full image should now take up the whole canvas now, and we can export again, this time with a new name since it's the 1K version. Export it as PNG or TGA. We will do the conversion to DDS in our next video. Okay, so that was the donuts. Close out that window and now let's do the plate. Load in the albedo map for the plate. There's no metal, so we don't need the metalness map. Drag and drop the plate specular map on top of the stack and set it to multiply. Go to Colors, Levels, tick the box for clamp input, enter a value of 0.45, and hit OK. Then go to Colors and Invert. Drag and drop the cavity map onto the top of the layer stack. Set the blending mode to Soft Light, or another mode if you prefer. Then drag and drop in the plate AO map and make sure it's on top. For the plate, I set this to Multiply because I thought that looked better, but you can use a different mode if you want. With all the layers visible, right-click in the Layers area and select New from Visible. Turn off the other maps and export only the final visible image. I suggest exporting in full resolution as PNG or TGA and keeping this file somewhere safe as a long-term backup. So first I export as a 4K version. Then I will resize to make a 1K version like we did before. Select the Scale tool, grab the bottom right corner and drag up, and in the pop-up window put width and height at 1024 and hit Scale. Then go to Image, Canvas Size, set width and height to 1024, and in the Resize Layers drop-down, make sure it says All Visible Layers and hit Resize. Finally, export this 1K image as a new PNG or TGA file to take forward. And then close the plate diffuse file. So we've got our diffuse textures done, and now we need to make our Skyrim-specific normal maps. As I've mentioned before, Skyrim doesn't use the regular normal map, but uses a version that includes this specular map in its alpha channel. While that may sound confusing if you aren't used to working with image files, it's actually very easy to do. The process that I've adopted, with many thanks to one of the awesome AU instructors, goes like this. Drag and drop the normal map into GIMP. Then drag and drop in the specular map. Right-click on the normal map layer and select Add Layer Mask. Choose White for full opacity and hit Add. Then click on the specular map layer, go to Select, then All, and copy it by either using Ctrl-C or going to Edit Copy. Next, click on the white mask that we added to the normal map layer. Use Ctrl-V or Edit Paste to paste the specular layer into a floating selection. Set the opacity for the floating layer to 90%. And finally, right-click on the floating layer and hit Anchor Layer. Hide or delete the original specular layer, and then right-click and choose New from Visible. Turn off all layers except the new visible one, and you should have a somewhat ghostly-looking normal map with obviously visible gray checker squares behind it to indicate the transparency. And that's it. We export this just like we've been doing. File, export as, file name, location, and format as PNG or TGA. Hit export, and then export again. And I'll do my first one in the original 4K resolution. Now I'll resize another version to 1K. Do the Scale tool, grab the bottom right corner and drag. Then in the pop-up, I'll put width and height to 1024 and hit Scale. Then I go to Image, Canvas Size, set width and height to 1024, and select all visible layers, and hit Resize. Then I export the 1K image as PNG or TGA, and close that file. Now we repeat for the plate. Load in the normal map, and then the specular map. Select the normal map layer, right-click and add layer mask. Select white for full opacity, and hit Add. Then select the specular layer, select All, and copy it. Click on the white mask in the normal map layer, and then paste the specular map. Change the floating layer's opacity to 90%, then right-click and select Anchor Layer. Turn off the original specular layer, and you should see the ghostly Skyrimified normal map. Right-click and choose New from Visible. Then turn off the original normal map layer and export the new ghostly one as PNG or TGA. Again, I'll do the first one in full resolution. Then I'll make a 1K version by selecting the Scale tool, dragging up from the bottom and putting 1024 for width and height into the pop-up window. To finish, go to Image, Canvas Size, set width and height to 1024, select all visible layers, and hit Resize. Then export that 1K image as PNG or TGA, and close the file. As a little bonus tidbit of info, if you'd like to see the specular maps for any of Skyrim's assets, you can actually reveal this hidden treasure from the normal map DDS files. With all credit to one of my fellow students over at the AU, here is how you do that. Load up the Skyrim DDS normal map. Go to Color, Components, Decompose, and select RGBA. Then turn off the other channels except Alpha, and that layer is the specular map. Be amazed and show all of your friends. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is make an environment map because we're going to attempt to make our metallic sprinkles look like they did in Mixer. Environment maps are only needed for metallic effects on your models, so you may not need one very often depending on what you make. As I mentioned before, I'm winging this part because I don't have much experience doing metals. So please don't take this as the gospel truth and do some more homework if you are making metallic items for Skyrim. Alright, first load in the specular map, then go to Color and Invert. Add the cavity map on top and set it to Multiply. Next, add the AO map to the stack and also set it to Multiply. Then the local gloss goes on the top of the stack and set that to Multiply. Finally, we put the metalness map on top and set this to overlay so that we retain some gray tones in the sprinkles, as you can see here when we zoom way in. Now this looks good, so let's right-click and select New from Visible, and then turn off all the other layers. I want to have a little more contrast, and with the whites looking even brighter, so I'm going to go to Colors, then Brightness Contrast, and set both of these values to about 33. As a final step, I'm going to make sure this map is grayscale, so go to Image, Mode, and tick the button for Grayscale. Now we just export like everything else. File, Export As, set the name and location and make sure type is PNG or TGA, and then hit Export and export again. Resize it down to 1K for our final version. Click the Scale tool, drag from the bottom right corner, make the width and height 1024, and hit Scale. Then go to Image, Canvas, set these to 1024, make sure it says All Visible Layers, and then hit Resize. Export that again as a new 1K version file in either PNG or TGA format. Have a look at your final environment map. It should not be just stark black and white, but should have some gray gradients where the metal parts are. Black on this map means no reflection, and white means complete reflection, and gray is various levels in between. And with all that done, we now have our Skyrim texture maps. We have diffuse and normal maps for both the donuts and plate, and an environment map for the donuts. And we are ready to put these into a NIF. Or are we? Not quite, but we're so close now. In the next episode, we will finish the last texturing step, which is to convert these PNG files to DDS. Now you might be tempted to skip that video if you already know how to do this conversion, but I'm going to cover some other important topics, so have a watch just in case there's something new to learn. It should be a pretty short one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!